Welcome to the Colig Experience episode. Get ready to dive into bold insights, experimentation, and groundbreaking leadership strategies. Today, we're exploring the intriguing parallels between societal evolution and organizational dynamics, inspired by the ideas of Karl Marx and Herbert Spencer. Discover how embracing change can transform your organization. Let's dive in. Karl Marx, the father of communism, is buried in Highgate Cemetery in London. In an astonishing irony, Herbert Spencer lies no more than 5 meters away from him. Spencer, a sociologist and philosopher who hasn't received his rightful place in the history of modern thought, believed in ideas completely opposite to those of Marx. He believed radically in individual freedom and individualism, arguing that society develops through the natural rise and fall of groups in the social hierarchy structure. Any attempt to support underdeveloped groups, those that fail to adapt themselves to the situation, represented interference in the process of social progress. If this reminds you of Darwin, it's no coincidence. Even before Darwin, Spencer coined the term evolution to describe biological and social development, and he's considered one of the fathers of social Darwinism. Darwin, whose life overlapped with Spencer's, both lived and worked in London during the second half of the 19th century, admired Spencer and even wrote in his book's introduction that Spencer's writings inspired his ideas on evolution and the origin of species. The Industrial Revolution and the awakening of nationalist movements in Europe led Spencer to believe the world had changed. He was right. He perceived older social models as militaristic structures, while in contrast, he thought that in the modern society of his time, diplomacy and international relations had replaced the role of force and war. Well, let's say he was less accurate in identifying these processes. About 10 years after Spencer's death, World War I broke out. Spencer interests us because at the center of his perception exists the assumption that the same scientific principles governing the biological world also operate in the sociological world. In his view, human society is a living organism that functions according to the rules of biological organisms. Can we really treat human organizations as living creatures? To answer this, we need to first understand what defines and characterizes a living creature. We've chosen to focus on 3 characteristics for now. Living creatures grow and develop organically. They reproduce and pass their genetic material to future generations. They need external energy to function and perform what they're designed to do. They have a membrane separating inside from outside, but there's constant transfer of material and energy between the internal and external environments. There are, of course, many more characteristics. We'll get to some later. But meanwhile, it's easy to see the similarities between these characteristics and those of organizations. Organizations that grow organically pass their culture from generation to generation. We often use the biological term DNA when talking about organizational culture and style. It's not entirely clear how this happens, right? But somehow, even as the organization grows, it continues to inherit the same behavioral patterns to its new components, even when these patterns no longer serve it or even harm it. We witnessed this firsthand when working with a pharmaceutical company that had maintained an overly cautious approval process for over 20 years. What began as a necessary safety protocol following a product recall in the 1990s had become an organizational habit that slowed innovation dramatically. Despite new leadership and changing market conditions, this organizational DNA persisted, even though it was now causing them to fall behind more agile competitors. When we helped them map their decision-making pathways, many executives were shocked to discover how these inherited patterns were actively undermining their stated goals of faster development cycles. By the way, speaking of self-harm, perhaps another similarity between organizations and living creatures relates to autoimmunity. living creatures sometimes get confused and use their immune system, which is meant to protect them from foreign agents, to attack themselves. If you think about it, this is an organizational phenomenon that's not so rare. Sometimes it's amazing to see how an organization gets confused and attacks itself. It doesn't have to be through aggressive force, fight. Usually, it will be through avoidance, flight. Everyone who has worked in a system that drags out processes and doesn't know how to make decisions, please raise your hand. This isn't unfamiliar, right? On one hand, acting with great energy in one direction while on the other, putting sticks in the wheels, as if pressing the brake and gas pedals simultaneously. Thus, organizational resources meant to advance the organization are actually directed, unconsciously, of course, against it. We encountered this exact scenario when consulting for a communications agency that had implemented a new collaborative platform. The goal was to improve information sharing across departments, but several teams had developed unofficial workarounds to avoid using it. When we investigated, we found that the senior leadership team had championed the platform publicly while continuing to use their old email systems privately. This created a confusing double message where the organization was simultaneously investing resources in the new system, while its cultural immune system was rejecting the change. The organization was effectively fighting itself, deploying energy both for and against the same initiative. We've talked about organizational DNA. Let's say a few words about energy. Systems need energy to develop. Where does this energy come from? That's an interesting point. On one hand, employees bring energy from home. On the other hand, organizational activity is also what charges them with new energy. We've addressed this before in this framework when dealing with burnout. There's no sustainability for an organization that can't serve as a charger for those who work in it. To thrive, an organization needs employees who bring their passion and creativity. And for them to do this, their experience must be one of meaning and potency. In this sense, the organization, just like a living organism, is a small energy factory. The third similarity between living creatures and organizations relates to boundaries, membrane. Living creatures depend on their ability to maintain a membrane that preserves balance between their internal part and the external environment. This membrane is never completely sealed. It's designed to enable connections and exchange of materials with the environment. Organizational boundaries are also never completely sealed. Organizations are constantly in an ongoing process of interactions and material exchange with their ecosystem. Not everything should penetrate the organization's boundaries. Sometimes the organization exists in a toxic ecosystem and must ensure that toxins don't penetrate and destroy it from within. And not everything should exit. Even within the organization, boundaries exist between different units, and these too are never completely sealed. These similarities don't prove, of course, Spencer's claim about the tight connection between biology and sociology. Discussion on this topic continues to this day. Is the behavior of a collection of biological individuals, i.e., an organization, society, subject to the rules of biological behavior? Despite our tendency to think the answer is affirmative, it's important to remember that this point is still at the center of scientific and philosophical debate, and different positions mainly represent inclinations of the heart, rather than scientific proof. Either way, until this debate is settled, we can certainly use biological models as analogies for organizational systems. We find great value in this, even if these are just analogies and not necessarily scientific explanations. For instance, biological systems develop through bugs, malfunctions. Science calls these mutations. Mutations happen all the time. Usually, they have no impact and don't survive. Sometimes they're sources of disease and suffering. But ultimately, the fact that we evolved from single-celled organisms to what we are today is thanks to these bugs. That's an interesting prism through which to think about your organization, isn't it? What mutations are developing in your organization? And what's even more interesting to consider is which of them will become a source of suffering and difficulty, and which will add capabilities your organization didn't have before. And perhaps an even more interesting question is which organizational mutations could have become promoting factors if you hadn't rushed to stop them. And that brings us to the end of today's podcast, where we explored the contrasting philosophies of Karl Marx and Herbert Spencer, touching upon how Spencer's biological analogy aids in understanding organizational dynamics. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends and colleagues so they can also stay updated on the latest news and gain powerful insights. Stay tuned for more updates.